Takeaways from the Nvidia Q2 2025 earnings call. The risk to Nvidia continues to be to the upside because the potential is being underestimated. It's not that the market is wrong by any means. I think the market is just pricing in whatever a mass of human beings can price in. But I think if you listen to Jensen, if you have been listening to him over the last 20 years, you should take his word at face value and not necessarily listen to market expectations. So he said a few important things. I think one of the most important things he said, in my opinion, is that as we approach the next couple of years, a country's GDP will be equivalent to a country's growth in AI. So it's very similar to electricity in the early 20th century, when the electricity production and, more importantly, consumption was kind of equivalent to GDP, and particularly the growth then became a good measure. So electricity consumption growth became a good measure of GDP growth, as we've seen over the last 100-something years since electricity exists. I think AI is the next level of that. It's a very similar concept underlying the dynamics, which is you have these foundation models that drive usage and also drive adoption and increase the productivity of countries, people working. And I think productivity growth in the end is the only real growth of GDP, maybe also population. So you have basically two factors that you can grow GDP in real terms. One is you have more people, the other is you have more productivity. With the people, it's not necessarily always positive. You can have a situation like in the Middle East or in Africa, where more people don't necessarily grow the GDP because they constantly fight each other and stuff like that. But overall, in principle, you can have a population growth equal to growing real GDP. But real productivity growth definitely grows GDP. There's always a caveat here. You can have a society where 20% of people grow 80% of the GDP, and then the other 80% of people get marginalized, and then there's a civil war and everything collapses. So I don't want to go down that route. Like we said many times in Orange Capital Partners, we're Goldilocks type people when it comes to the macro, right? We don't necessarily we don't have views on wars, we don't have views on natural catastrophes, none of that stuff. So we assume the world, the environment of the world, roughly as given, and then we analyze the economics within that environment, and we invest accordingly. So we believe that if we don't blow each other up, if we don't have a revolution, a civil war, none of that stuff, we expect roughly 40% growth in revenue for Nvidia for the next 5 years, driven by AI infrastructure demand, which is coming mainly from real-world AI. Real-world AI requires much bigger data investment and then inference investment. And the holy grail of growth actually is the many worlds AI, which is the generation of many worlds in a Monte Carlo type scenario, where a robot makes its own prediction of the next move based on a Monte Carlo tree search that it produces itself by generating lots of worlds in which the robot could potentially move ahead, and then narrowing it down to the best possible move based on some sort of reinforcement learning algorithm. I'm still working on the actual thesis here. It's mainly driven by Richard Sutton and by Jack Parker Holder. Those are the two main sort of academic directions. I'm taking Sutton as the foundation, and Holder's most recent PhD and his work with Genie at Google DeepMind as more recently what was actually going on, but I also discussed what Richard Sutton's doing with open-ended learning. So all of these, I feel like the world of AI is converging towards a world of continuous learning and data generation within the context of learning. So you will have a prompt, which is your current state. You'll prompt a bunch of artificial worlds, and then you will do some sort of Monte Carlo tree search type search that will find you the best possible trajectory for the next move. So we believe that real-world AI will basically become a mass adoption of the mu-zero approach of AlphaGo, but in the real world. So that's kind of the way we see the world. In a world like that, we believe that Nvidia has at least 40%, if not more, growth. and therefore we believe that, of course, the stock where it is right now is a very good investment, because you can assume at least 40% growth if you don't also account for things like inflation and all that stuff. So that's kind of where we live. I think the most important thing, again, what Jensen said, is that a country's GDP will be equal to a country's AI investment and demand. So one thing is to invest in AI, the other is also to have the demand. To have the demand, you have to have know-how, researchers, companies, sophisticated companies that can take advantage of these tools. China is certainly one market, the US is another market. For the rest of the world, it remains to be seen, but it's also plausible that the speed of knowledge transition here is very fast, and therefore we'll have a global surge in AI demand. So again, we have to look at demand more than actually just investment, because you could also have sort of an internet boom style investment with no real returns. It doesn't feel to us like that, because real world AI will yield very quickly results, for example, digital twins, and then later on open-ended learning in the real world through experience. Those things will very quickly show massive results. We could also envision, let's say, investment AIs that drive themselves by self-referential learning through experience with the real world, and making much better investments, for example, even running companies. So there's a lot of potential on the real world AI front, and therefore we believe that the demand and the supply of AI infrastructure will be very high, and Nvidia is a key player. Not 100% market share by any means. We believe that 30% market share is plenty. So if we have a $10 trillion spend on AI infrastructure, and Nvidia garners $2 to $3 trillion in revenue, that's a 10x in 5 years. That's plenty for the stock to do well. So that's kind of where we live. A couple of other things that they said, just as far as investment is concerned, they're ramping up Vera Rubin, which is their next generation. But I think fundamentally, we want to keep Occam's razor. We're very good students of Occam's razor. The simple thesis for Nvidia is that inference is going to be driven by obviously exposing AI to the real world, but also training will be more and more inference. So that's something also Elon Musk said. We will have a situation where every instance, every rollout will generate its own inference and training data for the next training cycle. So the concept of self-learning agents, open-ended learning agents, implies that inference is part of the training process. So we believe that training and inference actually will converge. And then when you have this many worlds interpretation of AI that we're working on, again, I'm gonna be more specific about what I mean with that. But just for now, let's say that the future AI systems will generate their own trajectories and choose the best trajectory given the current state, and therefore we'll have to do a lot more inference. That's the main driver. What I'm saying is that Nvidia is going to be driven by inference, and the convergence of inference and training will drive much more demand, particularly in the real world AI space. We also have massive amounts of investments in electricity infrastructure and the perf per watt and perf per dollar, which is really what drives Nvidia's products, because the more you invest, the more you save. That's something Jensen often says, and it shows in the demand. I mean, people wouldn't be buying their products if it just wasn't much more profitable for them to buy. If you have a $10 billion investment and you can improve your performance per dollar by 10%, that's $1 billion of savings or more revenue that you can create. So to summarize, Nvidia's earnings call was incredibly positive. The stock reaction wasn't, but that's okay. It was actually a non-event. And I think the market, it's an interesting case study for investors to see how Nvidia is in fact a very cheap stock. And the reason it's cheap is because people just don't see the opportunity. It's very similar to Tesla, that the magnitude of the opportunity, I think, can only be seen if you really have a good grasp of where AI is going. And I think Richard Sutton's presentations that we've discussed recently are a very good starting point for people who are interested in understanding really where this thing is going. I think Markus Hutter, for example, another very, very important researcher in the field of AI, particularly reinforcement learning. I think Jack Parker Holder, and his PhD. We will discuss all these things in more detail. The purpose of this podcast series is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So this is a very good example of how I think it's worth digging into the science and the technology in order to understand where these investments are going. Thank you.